The Inquisition is commonly known as one of history's most notorious organizations, and one of history's worst examples of religious fanaticism. But what was the Inquisition when one looks behind the popular conception? In this video series we will go over the history of the Inquisition, from its birth in the High Middle Ages, to its decline and fall in the 18th and 19th century. We will look at subjects like why the Inquisition was created, how it developed, how it operated, and whether it can be said to even have existed. To understand the origins of the Inquisition, one first have to understand the changes that took place in European society during the High Middle Ages. The first change is the growth of popular heretical movements, such as the Cathars and the Waldensians. These movements, mainly located in the Rhineland, southern France and northern Italy, gained large followings and threatened the Catholic Church's spiritual authority in those regions. The second change was an increase in the persecution of heretics by European lords and kings. This increased persecution of heretics was accompanied by a general increase in the persecution of minority groups in medieval society between the 10th and 13th century, which the historian R.I. Moore describes as the formation of a persecution society in Europe. Moore argues that these changes was mainly due to lords and kings trying to consolidate their powers in society by enforcing orthodoxy and homogeny. In the case of heretics, this can be seen with the criminalization of heresy as a result of anti-heresy laws, which started to spring up in the second half of the 12th century. In the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had mainly tried to counter heresy with missionaries and persuasion. The Church in those centuries thought that since the truth had been revealed, it could be demonstrated, and many churchmen exhibited great faith in persuasion and a great patience in applying the faith. However, due to the increasing violence against heretics and the growth of popular heretical movements, the Church over time started to change its treatment of heretics, and it began to move towards a more aggressive and centralized way in countering heresy. In the Church, the responsibility for countering heresy during the Middle Ages technically lay with the local bishops. The councils of Montpellier in 1062 and Toulouse in 1119 demanded that bishops should hand over known heretics to the local secular powers for judgment and punishment, but this was rarely done. The reason that most bishops rejected this demand was because handing over heretics to the secular courts often resulted in the heretic's execution, which by most bishops was seen as a participation in the shedding of blood. This general inhibition would start to change with the Council of Reims in 1148. The council marked the beginning of the Church's aggressive and coercive stance against heretics. It saw an end to the inhibition by bishops to hand over heretics to the secular powers, and also stressed the importance that local bishops and clergy actively search for heretics in their local areas, on the premise that there are heretics to be found. Decades later, in 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a decretal known as Ad Abolendam, which has been referred to by many historians as the founding charter of the Inquisition. The document did not necessarily contain anything that was essentially new in the Church's treatment of heresy, but it strongly enforced the aggressive sentiment and methods in countering heresy set out at the Council of Reims, and took them to a new level. The document contained a long list of heretical sects condemned by the Church, along with the condemnation of anyone supporting the sects. Pope Lucius perceived the task of priests and bishops to identify heretics, but continued to leave the problem of judgment and punishment to the local secular courts. Following the enactment of the Ad Abolendam, every bishop and archbishop was now forced to visit parishes where heresy had been reported twice a year, working with the local authorities in search of heretics. In the following decades, the Church's punishment for heresy became more severe, and popular support for the severity also increased. In year 1209, in an attempt to eradicate the Cathar heresy in southern France, Pope Innocent invoked an army in northern France which went to war with the Cathar sects, in a conflict that would last for 20 years and would come to be known as the Albigensian Crusade. The war quickly fell out of the Pope's hands as the French knights committed great atrocities against the Cathars, who were mercilessly being slaughtered without any formal trial or hearing, or chance to repent. The disasters of the war showed that the Catholic Church needed a new method for countering heretics that would keep the violence of the secular powers at bay. The Church also needed a more investigating approach to counter heresy, since most heretical groups went into hiding and were less open about their beliefs after the Albigensian Crusade. In 1231, Pope Gregory XI issued the letter Il Humani Generis to the Dominican Covenant in the city of Ravensburg, condemning the heresy in the city. The Pope charged the Dominicans with setting up an inquisitional tribunal and also sent a traveling judge to help the order root out the heresy in the city. The judge was instructed to seek out heretics via investigation, and if heretics were found, they would be prosecuted by the judge directly, according to ecclesial laws. The Inquisition in Ravensburg was very successful and led to the creation of a new separate profession, an agent of the papacy, working both as an investigator and as a judge. This was the birth of the Inquisitor. In the following decades, the papacy would enlist more inquisitors to counter heresy, and a specialized literature would grow out of the Inquisition's prosecutions of heretics. As a result, the inquisitors over time became more effective in their search for heretics, and their methods became more formalized. The main feature that made the medieval inquisitors novel was their use of the latest legal techniques to investigate heresy, which had emerged out of a new interest in Roman law at the University of Bologna. Until the 13th century, European countries had been using old legal codes that was grounded in accusation. In these systems, the legal process started when a member of society made a formal accusation against another person. If this was done, the defendant can demonstrate his innocence by either producing a character witness, who will demand an acquittal, or undergo trial by ordeal. If the defendant was acquitted, the accuser was vulnerable to punishment for defamation. Real evidence had little to no relevance in these legal systems, and a person with a bad reputation could never win a legal battle against someone who was generally thought of as honest. In contrast, the new prosecution system adopted by the medieval inquisitors was known as inquisito. The term refers to a prosecutor opening up a case and starts an investigation, where it collects reports and evidence that it later uses to make a verdict on. The new system of inquisition was an obvious improvement over the old ways, and slowly spread to the secular justices. In fact, it worked so well that it still forms the backbone of criminal investigation in continental Europe to this day. The way a medieval inquisitor operated on was very systematic. The inquisitor started by traveling with an entourage to the area that he had been ordered to investigate. When he arrived, he took contact with the local authorities and established an inquisition tribunal. The inquisitor then preached a sermon in a public square condemning the evils of heresy and pleading to the listeners to come forward with confessions and accusations. Later on, summonses would be handed out to suspected heretics and people who were suspected to have knowledge about heretical activity. Once a list had been created, the inquisitor would proceed to interrogate the accusers and the suspects. The purpose with the interrogations were not only to discover if the known suspect held unorthodox beliefs, but also to learn about the suspect's acquaintances with heretics and their sympathizers, since heresy often had a strong bondage within social networks. This method of interrogation proved very effective since it helped the inquisitors to unravel whole heretical networks that could consist of up to dozens of people. The method was even so effective that there are several examples of converts that were so helpful to the inquisitors that they were later employed on the inquisitorial staff themselves. When a suspect was summoned, he or she were often presented with evidence that accusers and other suspects had supplied against them during earlier interrogations. The social pressure it created was very effective, since the reward for immediate confessions were substantial compared to the steep penalties for relapsing or refusing to repent. The medieval inquisitors were allowed to use torture during the interrogations, but this was rarely used, and when it was restricted by several rules that the inquisitors had to follow. If torture was employed, it was not allowed to be unnecessarily brutal or inflict permanent injuries to the suspect, and a medical expert were always needed to be present and intervene if the interrogation went too far. Most people today know that using torture during interrogations usually make the suspect confess whatever he needs to in order to make the pain stop. The medieval inquisitors were well aware of this, and if a suspect confessed while being subject to torture, he needed to repeat the confession later while not being subject to torture. When the interrogations were over and guilt was established, condemned suspects were asked if they wished to abjure their heresy. If they said yes, they were given a penance which usually took the form of a badge of shame that the heretic had to wear in public. The purpose with the badge was to shame and stigmatize the convicted heretic, and this was often followed with a public spectacle where the convicted heretic was condemned and had to confess his crimes in front of the local people. The inquisitors' treatment of relapsed heretics or heretics who refused to repent was much harsher than the penance. In these cases, the inquisitor could charge the heretic with a prison sentence that could last for life, and in the worst cases, the convicted heretic who refused to repent was handed over to the secular authorities, which usually resulted with the heretic's execution. In popular culture, the medieval inquisitor is usually conceived of as a dank figure in a dark dungeon equipped with a variety of means of torment. And while it's definitely true that there is no defense to antagonizing death over religious disagreements, this picture of the medieval inquisitors is undeserved. Most people interrogated by the Inquisition were never subject to torture, and executions were very rare, occurring in about 5% of cases in surviving records. The reason for this is due to the fact that the goal for the inquisitors was not to kill, but to convert people and bring them back into a union with the church. An execution of a heretic was therefore often seen as a failure by the inquisitors, since the soul of the heretic was not saved. The inquisitors also feared that an execution would reinforce the heretic's status as a martyr in their own community. However, when it came down to it, most people were not willing to become martyrs and instead chose the penance and return to the church. One last important thing to mention about the medieval Inquisition was that it actually were non-existent. That is not to say that there were no inquisitors during the Middle Ages, but there did not exist any organization called the Inquisition. Inquisitors during the Middle Ages, who are more properly referred to as papal inquisitors, answered directly to the papacy and operated independently from other organizations. In conclusion, one can say that the invention of the medieval inquisitor was largely a success for the Catholic Church in countering the heretical movements of the High and Late Middle Ages, and the medieval inquisitors would continue to operate this way throughout Europe until the creation of the institutional inquisitions in Spain and Italy in the 16th century. I hope you learned something new about the medieval Inquisition from this video, and if you want to do your own research, you can find the literature used in this video in the description. And don't forget that if you like this video and want to see more videos like it, hit the like, share and subscribe buttons.